Rest of This Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Rory, you know that Fuse have been very generous in their offers to members and to supporters of The Rest of This Politics. So how about this one? Anyone who switches energy supply to Fuse, you get free membership to this wonderful podcast and The Rest of This Politics Plus for the rest of 2025.
Well, that's a very, very generous offer indeed. All you have to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics when signing up.
And you will get, as a member of Trip Plus, all of the episodes ad-free. Question time episode, you'll get that a day before everybody else. You get access to members-only live streams. You get early access to tickets for our live shows days before the general public.
And we'd love to have you as one of our members. And hopefully it's just the perk you need if you're considering switching energy provider. It's always worth mentioning that Fuse generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables.
Anyway, Roy, I had a look at Trustpilot, and on there, people give Fuse 4.7 out of 5. That's a very, very high mark in the modern demanding age. And there is comment after comment about how helpful and attentive people find the service that they get. And I do think people appreciate speaking to real human beings rather than those awful chatbots.
So download Fuse's app now and use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more. Welcome to the Rest of This Politics question time with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And Rory, there's a question here from Tom, who wants one of your famous explainers. Rory, I don't know why they think you do explainers. I think I'm very explicatory. They obviously think you're better at these sorts of things. Rory, please could you do an explainer on DeepSeek? Have you tried it? Why did it wipe billions from Western tech firms? Why did NVIDIA in particular take such a massive hit? What are your thoughts on the dangers of a Chinese-created large language model that refuses to answer if you try to talk to it about Tiananmen Square or Taiwan? Thank you, says Tom. Loved the show. Go on then,
So,
explain away.
DeepSeek was released as an app on your phone. You could download it a few days ago. And it is something very, very similar to ChatGPT in the way that it works. You type in a normal query and it produces a very sophisticated response very, very quickly. Why is this important? It's important because there were two fundamental ideas around AI, if you and I had been speaking about this 6 months ago. One of them is that America would always have the lead. And connected to that was that these AI models needed to require an incredible amount of investment in chips, water, and electricity, because you needed to run these huge, expensive churning models. And those two ideas were connected because the idea was that it was only things like Microsoft and Google who would actually have the money and the compute power and the sheer muscle to be able to run these enormous large language models. And the cliche as recently as a few months ago was China will always be 1 or 2 years behind. So we're not going to be surprised if China catches up on, ChatGPT 3 2 years after we release it, but we'll always have ChatGPT 4 out by then. And suddenly, China releases this model, DeepSeek, which turns out to be quicker and smarter in many, many ways than ChatGPT and be ahead of the American models. And then in addition, they announced that they had managed to produce this thing with very many fewer chips, with less use of electricity, less use of water, and less money spent on training the model. And that affects a lot of things. I mean, Trump was about to invest $550 billion in electricity, partly because these large language models, a problem actually for climate too. These large language models consume so much energy. Now, if you were to talk to our friend Reid Hoffman, who we interviewed on Leading, he would say, but remember he's on the board of Microsoft, but he would say, okay, I thought we were going to be a few months ahead of China and maybe we're not as far ahead of China as I thought, but basically there's a lot of evidence suggesting that all they've really done is intellectual theft. They've basically stolen ChatGPT, repackaged it and released it. And anyway, the model they released, maybe it's quicker and smarter and faster, but we could have done it. We just chose not to because we were actually investing in trying to get to the next snazzier model rather than producing a lighter model. I think that may be possibly the truth is somewhere in between. It may be that China has not pulled off something quite as spectacular as people suggested. And NVIDIA stocks, they're the manufacturer of the chips that you need for AI, plunged 540 billion and then recovered a little bit, probably overvalued anyway. So may not have achieved anything quite as dramatic as people thought, but it's still unbelievably interesting because it suggests that the US cannot rely on this massive lead. And it also suggests that one of the things that's stopping AI being rolled out, one of the reasons, for example, that we're not replacing all call centers with GPT-4 at the moment, is less about hallucination, it's more about cost. In fact, it costs more to run these models than a human. They're employing a human in a call center in Kenya. But if China has worked out how to do it cheaply, that'll make a big difference.
There was something, what's the right word, Rory? Find me the right word for this. The feeling I had on seeing these tech billionaires complaining that their tech and their data was being misused for profit by somebody else. I kind of thought there was a bit of, the biter gets bit from time to time. But it just shows you the centrality of these tech companies to the markets. We were talking about for 24 hours or so market turmoil in different parts of the world, but particularly the US, because these share values were just, were plummeting because suddenly people think, my God, the Chinese can do this better, which of course, from China's perspective is a great hit. Of course, there is that political point. And again, how much will people care about this? You and I probably would care quite a lot. Would you want to respect and value and trust something? Whereas if you did say, why is Tiananmen Square famous? They will give you all sorts of parades that went on and happy events and so on. And they won't mention what you and I and most of our listeners would know it for. But then again, you look at some of the American, let's look at Twitter right now. Twitter is a sea of misinformation and misleading, bullshit put out by Musk. So I thought it was a very, very interesting. I mean, Trump called it a wake-up call to the American tech industry. In a way, it was.
Well, it's also fascinating because I put out a little tweet saying this was a real game changer. Immediately got attacked by an enormous number of Trump supporters saying, you don't know what you're talking about, you're a complete ignoramus. And then as soon as Trump came out and said it was a wake-up call, they all suddenly went silent on me.
Suddenly your IQ went from being low to being high again.
Yeah, I suddenly became much smarter again. The other question, I guess, which the US tech companies are betting big on is the idea that people won't want to share their data with China. And I wonder whether that's true, because if you think about what you'd be using it for, there's so many things DeepSeek can do so powerfully, so quickly, and so cheaply straight away.
Are you using it?
Yeah, I'm using it all the time. And I'm actually often moving stuff between ChatGPT and DeepSeek and comparing them. And I'll take an initial ChatGPT answer, and then I'll feed it into DeepSeek saying improve it.
And do they improve it?
Yeah. They often actually make it much, much sharper, and they bring in data that wasn't in there before. So, for example, if you were to ask ChatGPT, put the pros and cons around Heathrow Airport, and then you were to take its answer and paste it into DeepSeek, DeepSeek would suddenly have all the facts and figures inserted that ChatGPT didn't have.
When you said earlier today, I need to get back to the hotel for half an hour to do a bit of research, do you just sort of ask ChatGPT and DeepSeek, or do you actually read anything? Are these famous books that you keep referring to, do you actually read them?
I do a combination of an enormous number of things. So as you saw, I've been reading books about Donald Trump's first term. I've also been on the internet trying to get my head around Mertz's 5-point plan. I've been calling my friend Geld Knaus. And then I was calling my unfortunate friend Felix, who does not want to be associated with my views on tariffs. And then I've been trying to organize those thoughts using large language models. So you're quite right. Part of my preparation is indeed these things. And I think we'll find that we will increasingly be using these as, I think it's like having an incredibly smart 18, 19-year-old with infinite patience alongside you who you can use as a research assistant.
I do sometimes put in to ChatGPT, what do you think Alastair Campbell and Rory Stewart will discuss on their podcast this week? And I do it after we've recorded. And they quite often get between 50 and 90%, I would say.
Final creepy thing, and then I'll stop talking, right? Final creepy thing. And this was ChatGPT, and it wasn't Gemini, and it wasn't DeepSeek. I took 4 photographs of my living room in London, and I asked it, who lives here? And it produced 3 names, of which number 1 was Rory Stewart.
Number 2?
Number 2 was Simon Schara. And number 3, for some reason, was Helena Bonham Carter. But it was a kind of, it would be interesting to work out how it put that together.
It found a magazine piece somewhere with some pictures.
No, I don't think so. I think what it did is it did give an explanation of how to come up with it. It said that it had noticed that the frame around the mirror looked Jordanian, the carpet was Afghan but it had a Buddhist reference, the table looked like it had a Jali pattern, but there were also bits of old posh upper class English furniture and paintings. And so it concluded this was somebody interested in history and travel who lived in a London house, and it could tell from the proportions of the window. It was pretty impressive. And the fact that it chose me first, I thought was weird.
Yeah. Now, a question here from Ross Brannigan in Zurich. What do you make of Lord Mandelson's newfound adoration for Trump? He was quick to disavow his previous criticisms, which comes across as disingenuous at best, pathetic at worst. Another example of how tyrannical leadership is normalized when so many other countries seek to brown nose those who otherwise wouldn't see the light of day. What do you make of it?
So Peter Mandelson's our new ambassador to Washington, but he's also somebody that you have known very, very well for many years. Give us a little portrait of this man who's now been made the ambassador to Washington. Tell us a bit about his life, tell us a bit about his character, and then we'll get on to the nub of what he's done.
Well, when I first met Peter Mandelson, he was applying for a job to be communications director at the Labour Party, back under Neil Kinnock's leadership, and he got that job. Prior to that, he'd worked as a TV producer under John Burt. And he then went through various stages of staffdom at the Labour Party before eventually becoming an MP, cabinet minister, in and out of the cabinet a couple of times. Blamed me a bit for him, for the out bits.
Can we pause on that? Why did he blame you? What were the out bits and why might you have got blamed? And was this fair?
I don't think it was fair. I think he blames me because he couldn't bring himself to think that maybe Tony had made that decision. And also there was, in relation to one of his departures from government, it is true that I basically said, I've got to have an answer, because I was sort of getting harangued by the media and I was about to go and do a briefing. And I think my body language was just not very good. I went downstairs to the lobby room and I said, look, Peter's seeing the Prime Minister now. Let's just sort of see how it pans out. It was I wasn't on form, so I think he felt I was sort of hanging him out to dry.
So to remind people that the reason that he resigned, the reason Tony Blair decided to let him go, and the reason you thought that you needed an answer is that one of them was a controversy about, am I right, about getting visas for a man who'd been a wealthy Labour donor, and another one had been about somebody paying for his mortgage, or have I got these things confused?
The first one was about the mortgage. Geoffrey Robertson, fellow Labour MP, who helped him with his mortgage. And then the second one was about the Hindujas getting a British passport. I don't know, they were wealthy donors, but they were very, very wealthy business people. And in both of them, essentially, it was the process that became very, very difficult. That being said, Peter is a phenomenal political talent. He's clever. He's done other jobs. He's been a European commissioner. He came back to be essentially deputy to Gordon Brown. He was given the title First Secretary of State. And he's also, he's always, yes, courted controversy, but is a very, very, very smart political thinker and political operator. And in relation to the question from Ross in Zurich, I was thinking the other day, if either you and I, Rory, had been nominated for this position, there is far more to recant than what Peter Mandelson has said about Donald Trump. They dug up an interview he did with an Italian journalist, I think it was, where he said that he was racist and he was a bully, and very, very mild by comparison with the sort of stuff that you and I have been saying. So he then did an interview with Fox News, would you believe, to say that those comments were wrong and ill-judged. Now, Ross says that's disingenuous at best, pathetic at worst. I think it is just sort of saying, right, I'm going to be the ambassador. My job is to try to have good relations with the United States. The United States at the moment is totally dominated by Donald Trump and the people around him. My job is going to be to get in with them. So I totally understand why he did it. I understand why people like Ross think it's appalling. But it is, I'm afraid, kind of the sort of thing that diplomats have to do.
So let's step aside from ambassadors at the moment and think about world leaders dealing with Trump. So when we saw Kevin McCarthy, the former leader of the House of Representatives, in Switzerland last week, he said that what you have to do is just understand that all Trump's bluster is just that of a businessman trying to get a deal. And the way to deal with it is to make concessions to him and go and be nice to him and work on your golf. So I guess the question to you strategically, Alastair, would be, what is it that a leader is supposed to do? And my instinct is that they need to line up, that actually this idea that Kevin McCarthy and Trump have, that you can divide them, pick them off one by inviting them for games of golf. And that's what he's trying to do with Britain and the EU. I think, Europe's very unfair and Britain's slightly unfair, but, maybe I'll be nicer with Britain than I am with the EU. Actually, we need to form up in solidarity against him. And to some extent, you need to stand up to a bully.
Who actually said, I think it was Mark Carney who used that very phrase, the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up to them. We also talked to Tommy Vietor about this on this week's Leading. And he was very much, I think, in that camp that said he doesn't respect weakness, he respects strength. So that means playing to your strengths. So I would argue, just to go back to Peter Mandelson briefly, I would say that Peter knew he would take a hit with people like Ross in Zurich by doing what he did. He knew that. But in a way, he's playing to his strengths because Peter is seen as somebody who's quite Machiavellian. He's very good at getting in with people. He's very good at forming relationships. And so he would argue he's clearing the ground so he can actually do the job. We'll see if that works. All it will take is one sort of thing that Trump spots in a newspaper or on Fox News that upsets him, and he'll do the same. He'll try to do the same as he did with Kim Darroch. I agree with you, though. I think that actually a bit more unity between leaders. So, for example, I was disappointed at the response from a lot of governments about Trump coming out of the Paris Climate Accord. I think that was an opportunity to say we will have very constructive relationships with the United States, but it's important people recognize that was an internationally reached agreement which was having an effect. It was taking the world in the right direction, and it's not a direction that I share. I just think I would have wanted to hear a lot more of that kind of thing. And I think he does respect strength more. Now, the fact is America is a much more powerful country than virtually every other country in the world, with possible exception of China. So therefore, you have to think about it very, very carefully before picking a fight. But I think what he's being shown by Canada and Mexico at the moment is that when he does pick a fight, there's no point just rolling over. You've got to pick a fight back.
Which is why it would be sad, for example, if he managed to sort of charm Britain. He might well think, oh, well, I've picked a fight with Canada and Mexico. I'm about to pick a fight with the EU. So what I'll do is I'll cozy up to Britain in a sort of divide and rule strategy so I don't have a unified G7 or West against me.
We're recording this on the day that Keir Starmer has the meeting with the European leaders. That might be part of his thinking as to why he said what he said. One thing Tommy Vietor and I have in common is we cannot stand doorstep interviews in front of plane engines. Kamala Harris used to do it all the time with the engines going and you're sort of shouting and the wind's blowing around your hair. But he said that, Europe's really bad. Maybe Britain won't be so bad. It's totally a divide and rule. And I think Britain's got to be very, very careful that we don't say, okay, well, that's so good to get that. Let's go and try and get a trade deal. Let's hope it lasts longer than the one he signed with Mexico and Canada. And meantime, Britain has got to be rebuilding its relations with the European Union.
And that's why we need to rejoin the customs union. Anyway, on that great note, time for a break, and we'll be back soon with a question about Australia. Richard Robson, as you will be aware, Australia will be soon going to the polls. We're deeply concerned about the media's right-wing promotion and the billionaires here that have been celebrating with Trump, giving large donations to right-wing parties. It seems that the cost of living crisis here is really affecting people's opinions on the success of Albanese's policies over the last 3 years. What would be your advice to Albo and the parties to the left in fighting back and stopping the LNP gaining power again? We're terrified of Australia turning into America. Thank you. Go on then. What's your advice?
I don't know what my advice is, but I think there is definitely a big American impact upon this election. And it's showing itself in Peter Dutton, the Liberal leader. The Liberals remind people they're Tory party, as it were. He really is starting to strike a very, very populist note. And I think from Albanese's point of view, he's come out very, very strong against Musk, which I think is a good thing. He's kind of no messing around with that. I think he's identifying that this sort of far right kind of global engagement thing is happening. The right-wing newspapers are gunning for Albanese because they always do. So I think he's got to stand up and be strong. This goes back to our previous conversation. He has got to give a sense of Australia's future, and it's got to be rooted in decisions that he's taking. Some of them he's already taken, some of them he's going to take if he gets another term, that speak to the things that people really care about, but fight back against this stuff in a way that I think the progressives thus far have been a bit scared of fighting it.
Well, it's amazing that Albanese is facing such a big problem because, of course, I felt very much on my visit to Australia how lucky Australia is compared to Europe. I mean, many of the things that we would have thought would drive populism in Europe aren't happening in Australia. For example, there's not a massive debt crisis. The budget, it's got a budget surplus. Australia's also got this amazing ability to balance being really rich in natural resources and really good at services. It's got immigration control, right, going all the way back to stop the boats, but it's also got a very interesting, diverse, talented population coming in. It's got compulsory voting. It's got a single transferable vote. It's got all the structural, economic and social mechanisms in place, which you would have thought would make it easier to fight populism in Australia than almost any other advanced mature democracy. So why is it with all that, Albanese is still struggling?
He's not struggling in a way that, Scholz is struggling. Last poll I saw on preferred prime minister, Dutton's on 40, Albanese's on 34. Among women, Albanese's on 36, Dutton's on 31. This sort of populist right-wing thing is very much a kind of macho, male-dominated thing. So that's not terrible. One thing on the last more general poll, the coalition, which is what they call the Liberals, 51% among men, Labour on 44, 4% undecided. Women, Labour on 49, Dutton's party on 46. So it's close. And so therefore, nobody should think this is kind of slam dunk, the right-wing populists are going to win. I think Albanese understands that the blue-collar worker is absolutely key to winning, but also they are the ones that are being targeted in the main by this kind of right-wing populist stuff. And so I think you'll see stuff that he will very, very directly be pitching towards them. But no, it's not. It's far from over.
I mean, should the Labour Party, this obviously vested interest from our point of view, be making more use of Peter Malinauskas, incredible Premier of South Australia, who's leading the charge on campaign finance reform, which I guess is partly in this person's question, getting the billionaires out of politics, making sure the Musks this world can't buy Australian politics, social media reform, etc. I mean, there's a real star, right? Or am I putting too much emphasis on one person?
No, I think when you get to the federal elections, then the focus very much is on the leader, and that's Albanese. But essentially, you've got to use your big campaigners, and they've actually got a lot of good campaigners, the Australian Labour Party, and they do love a campaign. I'll tell you one thing which I really think, both in Australia and New Zealand, somebody should come along and change this 3-year election cycle is just absolutely nuts. It doesn't feel that long ago that we were talking about when he won. And now here we are, we're hanging around waiting to see when he announces when the election's going to be. It's probably going to be in April or May. We should come back another time. We should maybe think about doing a special on the Australian election, because I think it will be very, very interesting. But I saw an interview Dutton did recently, and he was hammering quite a lot of Trumpian style talking points. It's a playbook.
Given that you've managed to get us such luminaries as Angela Merkel and Bill Clinton, do you think Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton might be interviewed on the podcast?
Well, let's hope so. I know we have a lot of listeners in Australia. I think they're definitely in our top 5 countries. So if anybody from Albanese team and Peter Dutton's team listening, please do get in touch with threstispolitics.com. Right, David Colley. Having just watched the excellent Brian and Maggie, which sponsored the podcast last week, where would you position your interview style on a typical episode of Leading? 0 being a doormat, 10 being a Brian Walden special. I don't think Brian Walden was 10, because 10 to me is rude, aggressive, argumentative. I think Brian was a very solid 8.
Very good.
Where are we, Rory? Where are we?
Well, I think interviewing's changing, isn't it? I think it's getting more old-fashioned. There's more leisure. There's more time. Tommy Vito, who people should listen to, had a lovely line, didn't he, about the fact that when Joe Rogan was interviewing Trump, the thing that impressed him most is that he was able to keep going for 3.5 hours without going to the bathroom.
That's not bad at 78. You've got to hand it to him. I still think there's a place for really aggressive, confrontational interviewing. There was a very good one by German standards with Alice Weidel on German television recently. I can't remember the name of the woman who did the interview, but it was very, very strong. Just wasn't letting her get away with bullshit. But the thing we found when we're doing the podcast interviews is that it's like when we did the guy from Mossad, Uzi Arad. There were things he said that we could have pushed back on them, but you just know that you're then going to get into a kind of, oh, well, you say this, but people just sort of get lost. So I think unless what they're saying is just outright untrue, objectionable, can I let them get away with it a bit? Because the most important thing, I think, in an interview isn't what the interviewer's questions are, it's what the answers are. You're trying to get interesting answers. And if you put somebody completely on the defensive just by being very aggressive, then you're unlikely to get good answers. You might get good theatre, but you don't get good answers.
So we're thinking about that a lot, aren't we? Because we've just interviewed, as you say, the Israeli National Security Advisor. You know, it would be the same if you went to interview, I guess, Xi Jinping or Prabowo in Indonesia. How do you get the balance between drawing out what's most interesting about them, how their minds work and how they view the world, and balance that against reminding the listeners that you disagree with them? Particularly true if you were interviewing Donald Trump. I mean, is the point to try to, maybe Trump's the most extreme and absurd example, but I don't know, Steve Bannon. Is the idea to try to get to the heart of who this guy Steve Bannon is and how he views the world? Or is the point to go on record saying that you think he's a fascist?
Yeah, or Musk. How would you interview Musk? Very interesting life story, lots of interesting ideas.
Presumably the reason why traditionally you do challenge them, even if you know it's not going to get anywhere and it makes the interview worse, is that you don't want them to get a free platform for building their supporters because they go unchallenged, I guess, right?
Yeah. But I think you can challenge people without necessarily falling into the trap of it just becoming kind of, you know, like some interviews, it's like listening to sort of, you know, polystyrene being dragged down a window because you know they're just locked into a battle that is going to go nowhere. It's a draw. It's a no-score draw from the start. It takes 5 minutes to get through it. I think sometimes we maybe are a bit soft. The other thing that I think our interviews we try to do is to draw out people's personality and their character. And I think you're less likely to do that. I think if they're prickly, that's going to come out whatever. You're going to see that. But I think if you make them prickly by being that sort of seeming a bit cynical or not really interested in their past or whatever it might be, I think you're less likely to get an interesting conversation.
Now, here we are. Vanessa Rogers. Why do you think misogyny and sexism are still acceptable in today's society? Why is it that the patriarchal society we live in has come on so little in the last few decades? Why is it that Rachel Reeves, with an undergraduate PPE from Oxford and a master's in economics from LSE, is demeaned as Rachel from accounts when all her male predecessors weren't even referred to by their first name alone when Chancellor of the Exchequer? Sajid Javid, Jeremy Hunt, Nadim Zahawi, et al.
Well, why do you think misogyny and sexism are still acceptable in today's society? They're not acceptable in today's society, but they're very present in today's society. I think a lot of that is, I'm afraid, driven by this kind of politics that we've seen come back in recent weeks, which is very, very male-focused, very macho. Trump is an example of it. Farage is an example of it in a different way. Orban is an example of it. Modi is a bit of an example of it. It's not necessarily that they're, you know, I don't know what their attitudes to women are. We know from Trump because of all the things he's said and done. But I think there's this feeling that they think they're playing into that the whole women's revolution thing went too far. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, inequality, if you look at the kind of the equality between men and women, I'd say men still come out on top. It's very hard to argue that this society is tilted too far towards women, but that is a very useful line of attack for people, particularly on the right, to get going. So the answer is the patriarchal society, it has come on, but it still exists. The thing about Rachel Reeves, I mean, the fact is, I think that's more about, is she... Liz Truss was, I'm not equating Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves politically or competence-wise, but, Liz Truss was demeaned. She's known globally as the lettuce because that was sort of part of the approach to her. Now, so I think that bit I'm less persuaded of. I think Rachel from accounts is a way of trying to undermine her because she's the Labour Chancellor. But, lots of, why did we call John Prescott two jags? Because it was a way of saying he's not really entitled to have nice cars because he's, working class bloke kind of thing. So I think politicians have always been demeaned in language by their opponents. And don't forget as well, it's been weaponized for money. Andrew Tate makes a lot of money out of spreading misogyny and knowing that there are some young men who want to hear it and buy into it.
And now launching a political party. I was interviewed on a podcast recently by somebody who clearly seemed to be quite keen on him and saying, what did I think about how Andrew Tate was coming back into politics? And there's this idea that's spreading amongst a lot of particularly young men excited by Silicon Valley that what you need to do is, smash things up, move things, break things, challenge things. Even young women. I was talking to a 12-year-old American last week who was saying, well, she knew she wasn't supposed to like Trump, but it was exciting. At least he was doing things. At least stuff was happening. And I think one of the underlying stories here is that we've allowed the sort of ordinary business of government to seem to people completely inert and paralyzed, as though nothing can ever get done. And we've given this huge space to the right to present themselves as the kind of party kind of energy and direction. And I think particularly for younger people, we missed this during the election, but talking to two 15-year-old Americans who were just astonished by how good Trump's social media campaign was and how bad Kamala Harris's was. How they were able to get exactly the right messages for young men hitting their phones. And some of it would be very specific. They could work out, obviously, if you were Jewish, and they could pass messages on Israel. They could work out if you were interested in gaming, and there could be interesting stuff about gaming. Whereas all Kamala Harris was doing was sending texts saying, please give us more money.
Right, on trust, Rory, Oliver Moore, somebody else pointed this out to me as well. When asked if you had to pick only one media outlet to get you news from, which would it be, in one of the last Q&A sessions, neither of you mentioned the BBC. Might you expand on this? Isn't the BBC supposed to be this all-encompassing media outlet? I suppose that was a bit of an oversight. We should have said, the BBC is still pretty good.
I love the BBC. I completely love the BBC. I'm heartbroken by what's been done to the BBC World Service, but they are an incredibly impressive outfit. I mean, we've just been traveling and we just met a BBC producer in a country who was so well informed, so rooted, doing a really great piece of investigation, running a great program. I think the problem from our point of view is that what the BBC has online for reading quickly is often pretty short. And so if you're looking for the 3,000 word or the 2,000 word analysis, I'm afraid the New York Times is more likely to be providing it than the BBC. Yeah. But I still think the BBC is an amazing thing.
But it is interesting. I think when we were growing up, or when we were younger, I think BBC instantly would have been the thing. I think the BBC has done itself a lot of damage in various ways over the last 2 or 3 decades. But however, I do think, BBC basically is still a very good thing. Now, another great institution of the United Kingdom, Rory, Mark Anderson wants to know, why is King Charles not speaking up in support of Canada, one of his Commonwealth realms, against Trump's antics?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm sure he'd want to, desperately want to. And I imagine he's taking advice, presumably from the British and Canadian governments, on what they think is suitable and what isn't suitable for a monarch. I mean, Britain, to some extent, sometimes when you talk to diplomats in Britain, they think Britain's only chance with Trump is that he likes the royal family. So maybe he's having to balance these two competing instincts. There's the interest has realm in Canada, and the interest has realm in Britain, where people are saying, for goodness sake, don't annoy him, because Trump's mother famously was a great monarchist, and the one thing he likes about Britain is the royal family. I don't know. It must be a very, very difficult position to be in.
That's the most open you've ever been at a question about King Charles, I have to say, Rory. So I think you've been talking to him, and I think he's planning something. No.
That's not the case at all, Alastair.
Rory, time for another explainer, I fear. Simeon Politik. What a great name for Arrestis Politics listeners. Simeon Politik. Politik as in the German version with a K at the end. Can you please give some background on M23? That is not the motorway, that is a military group. Where they rose from, any tribal ethnic affiliation, what they stand for and demand, and why Rwanda would want to offer them military assistance. This is big stuff going on, isn't it?
This is really, really big stuff going on. So to put it in context, this is happening in DR Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is this enormous African country which straddles the continent. And it is home to well over 100 separate insurgency groups. And one of those groups in the eastern Congo, probably the most powerful at the moment, is the M23. In terms of its ethnicity, it's traditionally a Tutsi-dominated group. And Rwanda, people remember during the genocide, that genocide was targeted by the Hutu community against the Tutsi community. So some Hutu leaders were killed, but it was predominantly a genocide of the Tutsi. And so the emergence of the M23 as a group comes partly out of that conflict. And it has historically received support from the Rwandan army. It's received support from the Rwandan army partly because Rwanda has said that the Tutsi ethnic group are under threat, because there are also Hutu rebel groups in eastern Congo, part of the insurgency, and there are many, many other types of insurgency groups. There are people who are proto-communists, there are Islamists. Almost every conceivable different ethnicity has its own militia group. It's come into the news, though, most recently because it has yet again managed to capture Goma. And Goma is this enormous city, which I know quite well, of about 1.5 million people on the northern edge of a large lake. It's the center point for all aid and relief organizations into Congo. Congo, one of the poorest countries in the world. Congo, where there have been many Ebola outbreaks. And Goma, is a place I visited frequently, both when I was in the British government and when I worked for NGOs, because it is the big center of operations into Eastern Congo. So highly controversial, massive recriminations between the Congolese government and the Rwandan government. International players trying to get involved. There's been a big UN peacekeeping force struggling to control the situation in Eastern Congo for more than 20 years. But again, to bring it to our bigger themes, Eastern Congo is also a place where China has come in very hard. So last time I was there, I found myself sitting next to a Chinese copper mining engineer. Then I met with American companies who were talking about how they were getting out of Eastern Congo and handing over to the Chinese because they were unable to meet the environmental or labor regulations. And it's also a place where private military companies are beginning to play, and where a lot of the things that we care about, poverty, population expansion, violent diseases, and the huge sucking sound as the United States extracts itself from Africa and refuses to play the role that it would have played. In fact, that it played only a year ago when this was happening in Eastern Congo, which was the immediate response was of the US to try to resolve the problem between M23 and others.
I mean, and it's not just America, though. I mean, it does seem to me that an awful lot of countries who you might have expected to get involved, at least pretty openly and diplomatically, are just kind of sitting this one out. And of course, the UK, we had Rwanda absolutely central to our politics because the last government was trying to get this system underway to send people arriving on the boats to Rwanda, went nowhere. Do you think that Kagame, as the leader of Rwanda, has in part been doing these kind of international deals and international arrangements as a way of softening our response, other countries' response when this kind of thing's happened? Because it does seem like a straightforward intervention in another country's affairs, is it not?
So Kagame is a very, very able politician. He models himself on places like Singapore. He's pulled off a pretty remarkable economic success story. He's taken over this country that was torn apart by genocide that killed well over 1 million people. And he's generated the fastest growth rates in Africa. He's also clearly, to put it mildly, an authoritarian ruler. He matters to people well beyond its size. It's geographically a very small country, as you can see on a map, because it is one of the few development success stories in Africa. It's a place that's positioning itself as a center for African services. And as you say, because he's very innovative and cares about development, a lot of people want to work with Rwanda. If you wanted to do an international development program and pilot it, it's one of the most effective governments that you can work with in sub-Saharan Africa. Things will happen very, very quickly. Plans will get done very, very quickly. As you say, he also offers things like that Rwanda deal about hosting third country asylum seekers for the United Kingdom. The one country that has got into a real confrontation with Kagame is not the UK or Europe, but the United States. But it's also a sense in which the world's changing, which is you get a sense that President Kagame doesn't need to worry as much about the United States as he would have had to 15, 20 years ago, that he feels that there are many other people that he can deal with, and American criticism cuts less hard.
Kenya and Angola have been trying to sort things out, haven't they? But they're going to struggle without one of the big players really backing them.
Absolutely. Angola matters in Congo, really matters in Congo. It's a wealthy country. It's got a decent military. It was actually involved in persuading Kabila, the last president, to step down. But fundamentally, the problem with Congo is governance, corruption, complete inability to get any public infrastructure built, decades of looting irresponsible ministers, which makes it very difficult for them to project into the international community, project to the world, seem credible. Okay, final question for me, Alastair. I've been saving this up because I think it's a real Alastair question. Sally McKee from New York. Please, can you tell me where I can find and learn that song the German protesters are singing? And what are the words in English, please? I wish we could sing it here. There we are, Alastair. Over to you.
Well, if this is the one that I think it is that they're singing at these protests that I mentioned on the main podcast that have been attracted by Friedrich Merz repositioning himself in relation to the far right in the vote that we described in detail on the main podcast, it goes as follows. Wehrt euch, leistet Widerstand gegen den Faschismus hier im Land, auf die Barrikaden, auf die Barrikaden. Now, you must be able to translate auf die Barrikaden.
Yeah, I think we can do this. The barricades, isn't it?
To the barricades, yeah. And the first bit means defend yourself, resist fascism here in this country. There you go.
Alastair, if we gave you a quick pause, would you be able to get the tune?
On my bagpipes?
No. Just to hum it or something. Can you just type it in and see if you...
Rory, it's a lovely song, and I'm glad that they're singing it against fascism in Germany. I would happily play my bagpipes and play that tune, although it's quite a hard tune to catch. But I think the lyrics are better than the melody. I thought
it sounded quite rousing. But anyway, maybe we can put a link into the newsletter for members.
Excellent.
Right.
Excellent.
Lovely to see you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Speak soon. Take care. Bye.